Okay, I think we can start now. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the NATO-Georgia Public Diplomacy Forum. I'm Misha Darchiashvili, former Deputy Defense Minister of Georgia, and I'm very delighted to moderate the panel on NATO's regional communication strategy. I'll kick off today's panel with a famous quote by great William Shakespeare. Talking is not doing. It's kind of a good deed to say well, yet the words are not deeds. To put in a nutshell, actions speak much louder than words. And as a moderator, I promise to keep this quote as a leitmotif of our today's discussion. In the face of increasingly aggressive propaganda campaigns from the enemies of civilized world, Russia in the east and Daesh in the south, strategic communications play a significant role in achieving NATO's political and military goals. Hybrid war conducted by Russia against civilized and democratic world clearly demonstrates that it is increasingly important that the alliance first acts proactively and projects stability, and then communicates adequately and effectively. Already starting from the Strasbourg-Kiel summit in 2009, if we check the key documents, whether it's NATO summit declarations or ministerial communiques, we can see the reference and the particular emphasis, the need to strengthen NATO's strategic communication capabilities. And of course, relevant steps have been following. One of the most successful achievements was establishment of NATO Stratcom Center of Excellence in 2014 in Riga, which operates very successfully and contributes to the improved strategic communications of the alliance as an organization as well as individual NATO allies. Nevertheless, the challenge posed by disinformation, spreading of the false information from the Russian Federation remains imminent, especially in this region, in the Black Sea region, and especially for Georgia and freedom fighter countries like Ukraine. In addition to the military invasion, occupation, and annexation, Russia permanently uses the disinformation to undermine Georgia's Euro-Atlantic integration, NATO and EU membership processes. Well, Euro-Atlantic integration is definitely reversible in our case because it comes from the demand from the public. Public supports this process. Nevertheless, we should not take this support for granted. We need to sustain and we need to increase it further. We will, of course, address these and other issues during today's panel with very distinguished speakers with whom I'm really delighted to share the stage today. On my immediate left, Barbara Marankova, head of NATO's Information and Documentation Center of Ukraine. Prior, Barbara has extensive experience of work at NATO headquarters in Brussels at Public Diplomacy Division. She worked as program manager for the Western Balkans, where she designed, planned, and implemented public diplomacy campaigns. In this capacity, she advised several NATO candidate countries on their national public awareness campaigns on NATO membership. She also worked at NATO's press and media office, and in March, she became director of NATO's Information and Documentation Center in Kiev. It's very nice to have you on this panel, Barbara. Rosaria Puglisi, well known to all of us. She leads the NATO Liaison office in Georgia. Rosaria has served in several diplomatic missions in Europe and Middle East, including delegation of the European Commission to Ukraine, Moldova, and Belarus, Office of the EU Special Representative for Moldova, EU Monitoring Mission in Georgia, Council of Europe and European Union Border Assistance Mission to Libya. In 2015, she was appointed as NATO Liaison Officer to the Central Asia. After that, she was transferred to Georgia, and currently she serves, as I mentioned, as the head of NATO Liaison Office in Georgia. It's a particular pleasure to have you here. And last but not least, Levan Dolidze, a career diplomat, good friend of mine. Levan held many important positions in the Foreign Service of Georgia. Levan was first Deputy Defense Minister of Georgia, where he supervised Georgia's Euro-Atlantic integration process. And Levan was very fine ambassador of Georgia to NATO, and currently he leads a Center for Security and Development based in Tbilisi. So welcome you all, and without further ado, I would like to invite Barbara to answer my first question. So I'm sure you all will be interested to hear her assessment on NATO's joint up efforts in dealing and in confronting with hybrid threats, and what role the strategic communications play in there.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good afternoon to everyone. It's my great pleasure to be here today. It's my third NATO-Georgia Public Diplomacy Forum, and I'm very, very pleased to be here again and and witnessing this conference to be getting stronger and bigger every year. Firstly, I would not bore you with all the definitions that we have about what is warfare, hybrid warfare, whether it's asymmetric warfare or fifth generation warfare or gray zone tactics. There are a lot of discussions happening between military experts and NATO experts on the right terminology. But maybe I would just look at the hybrid warfare as a puzzle. And this puzzle is composed of many small little pieces. Be it cyber attacks, be it usage of irregular forces or private security companies, be it energy blackmail, be it disinformation, propaganda, and we even witnessed a usage of a chemical substances as part of a chemical attack to reach a certain goal, be it military goal, foreign policy goal, or whatever else the adversary has in their mind. But we believe that in order to counter hybrid warfare, we also need to have a complex strategy which addresses all these individual pieces of puzzle, but not just on one. So if we have a cyber attack, then NATO adopts a cyber strategy. If we have, for example, threats against civil population, we reinforce our civil preparedness. I mean, all of these are obviously very important strategies to counter these individual pieces of puzzle, but they have to be done in a coordinated and strategic way. And this is how NATO is approaching this phenomena, already starting with the Summit 12 in 2014, where the heads of states and governments have given a mandate to NATO to start preparing procedures and tools and plans how to counter hybrid warfare. And then in 2016 at the Warsaw Summit, we adopted a respective strategy and actionable plans, and we are continuing to work on this towards our next summit in July. But one piece of this puzzle is disinformation and propaganda. This is something that all of us have seen and witnessed, not only in Georgia or in Ukraine, but also NATO as an institution is very often also targeted by propaganda and disinformation. And we have seen the past 2 years also many of our member states witnessing this phenomena. So NATO's response to this is to strengthen its strategic communication capabilities because a robust and well-functioning strategic communication is an important element in the fight against disinformation and propaganda. I will not go into details about what is NATO's definition of strategic communication. There are more valuable experts like Mark here that you have seen at the previous panel, Mark Leahy. But I would maybe develop this idea a little bit, how a well-functioning strategic communication in NATO's perspective can address disinformation and propaganda. First of all, I believe we need to have a proactive communication. We can't only be always reacting. Whether it's Russian so-called media outlets or some social media individuals who start spreading some misinformation or they twist the facts, we have to debunk, we have to get the record straight, but we can't always be running after the cart. We have to also put the ox in front of the cart. So in that sense, what the previous speaker, Sophia, said, having a proactive, positive narrative of who we are, what we do in support of our populations, what values we represent. This has to be first and foremost our first step in fighting disinformation. Secondly is transparency and availability of facts and information. In this regard, NATO has also done quite a lot of work in the past 2-3 years, not to say we haven't been transparent before, but particularly in the past 3 years, in light of Russian disinformation, we have created a dedicated webpage on the NATO website. We call it Setting the Record Straight. We collect the biggest myths and disinformation that are spread about us, about our allies, about our partners, and we provide factual information to counter these. We also actively engage with the journalists, with key opinion formers, with experts. If you have ever attended, for example, a NATO ministerial meeting in the headquarters, you can literally not move through the corridors because they're constantly packed with journalists from all over the world, including Russian journalists who are accredited to NATO. And we always provide press conferences, background briefings to journalists, etc., etc. The third point, which I particularly put a lot of emphasis on, is networks. What I mean by networks is to have friends. To have friends like journalists and media. To have friends from civil society who help us a lot with debunking, with looking for information in posting online. There are a lot of great organizations, be it in the NATO member states, be it across the street, so to speak, at the European Union, at the External Action Service, the EU East Stratcom cell, but also a lot of friends that we have elsewhere in Moldova, in Ukraine and Georgia. So these different institutions are helping us a lot in fact-checking and debunking because it takes a lot of time, a lot of effort. And in NATO, we don't have 20, 30 people sitting behind the computer the whole day, just Googling and fact-checking and looking at Google satellite images. So we have friends who do it for us, so to speak. But we also are an alliance of 29 member states. And we also are an alliance which has a big network of partners. So if we put all these people together, I think we really have an effective network which we need to use and work together to be more effective, to be more stronger, so to speak. And last but not least, coordination. That's the key word. And when I'm often asked about, so what is this strategic communication thing? But don't tell us this definition because we don't understand it. Tell us in a simple word, what is strategic communication? And for me, it's about coordination. And especially for an organization like NATO, which is an international organization, intergovernmental organization with 29 sovereign member states, an organization that is both political and military, which has its own political and military structures. Coordination is of utmost importance. So it's about being coordinated with our narrative, with our messaging on the political level of the House, so starting from the Secretary General and the North Atlantic Council, to be in parallelly linked with our Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe shape and our military head, but also with all the different commands that we have all over our territory, and going even down to the ground to our missions and operations. So to really create a Stratcom family, if you wish, within NATO and coordinate among ourselves. When we talk a little bit more about NATO's communication efforts with large, because I think it's important maybe to share a little bit what we are doing from NATO's perspective generally before going into individual countries or regions. We do realize that there is a lot of information out there. We do realize that people are not necessarily all interested in NATO issues. We realize that majority of citizens, be it from NATO member states, but also for partners, they don't really care about issues like security and NATO and NAC and summit and all these issues. And also, as always, you know, lack of resources is always the biggest headache. So our leadership decided a couple of years ago that we really need to refocus our communication efforts. We need to sharpen it. So we adopted a British-led model, which is called OASIS. So it's about setting objectives, about identifying target audience analysis. It's about finding the right tools and the right strategies how to address these audiences, and it was already alluded in the previous panel that you need to know your audiences and whom they trust, and you need to find the credible voices with whom they can speak and listen to, and then we need to measure as well our effects. So this is a new approach that we started doing in NATO's Public Diplomacy Division, and with this we really try to be more coherent and organized. Last but not least, especially in light of the disinformation and propaganda that is aimed against NATO and our individual member states, we also came to realize that we need to understand what's happening out there. We need to have the information, we need to be able to analyze the trend, and we need to know what is coming so we can better prepare. So modeling ourselves on the Lithuanian example, we have created our own Humble at the moment, but we are expanding our own information environment assessment cell, which is linked with our different missions and operations, with our commands, with our member states, and we try to collect different information, create analysis, and that helps us, where possible, of course, to predict certain elements that can happen, and in order not to be surprised, but to have a proactive communication. And this is particularly important for us, especially in the realm of our enhanced forward presence in the Baltic states and Poland. And we are particularly looking at this area because this is really a big target for Russian propaganda, is our presence in this region. So I'm going to stop here and we'll develop further.
Thank you for very comprehensive coverage of NATO's efforts to counter the hybrid threats. And I would be also very interested to hear your assessment how to measure the success, but I will ask this question at a later stage. You listed very interesting and important elements: proactive approach, transparency, network coordinations, all are extremely important to have effective strategies. I would particularly highlight the proactive efforts and measures from the NATO, from the partner countries, because if we look at the trend, we've been always on a reactive mode, which should be changed, and now we need to see more proactive efforts from the NATO side as well as from the partners. Rosaria, I would like to invite for your comments. Title of this panel is NATO's Regional Communication Strategy. But before we go to the communication issues, I want to hear your overall assessment of the NATO's policy towards the region, towards Black Sea region. If we look at the Warsaw Summit Declaration, Black Sea is mentioned 8 times in 5 different paragraphs, which highlights the importance of the Black Sea for the NATO, for the security and stability of the Euro-Atlantic area itself. So can you give us a better sense where NATO stands with this strategy?
Okay, let's talk about, on one side, the Black Sea, and on the other side, the regional strategy, the regional political strategy. As you know, my office covers not only Georgia, but also Armenia and Azerbaijan. And among these 3 countries, Georgia is the only one that has a clear aspiration to become a member. So even though, of course, there is one office, there is no one policy. The NATO policy in the region is very much dictated by the will and the interest of each individual country. What we do with Georgia, we don't do with Armenia, we don't do with Azerbaijan. So this is NATO policies are driven by the demand of the individual member states, or partners, sorry. As far as the Black Sea, it is true that especially after the annexation of Crimea and the increased presence of Russian military forces in the Black Sea, the attention of NATO has also increased in the region on the Black Sea. And there are increased efforts to coordinate better and to create better forces that could prevent and eventually respond to possible threats in the region. I'm hopeful that we will get some clear recognition of the Georgian engagement in the Black Sea in the communiqué of the summit. But already now, I think that we can talk about a good, positive story. Georgia and NATO cooperate closely on Black Sea security. We have at least we have a number of visits of NATO countries' vessels in Georgian ports, in Batumi and in Poti. We have trainings that are taking place for the Coast Guard. Georgia is involved in the Sea Guardian operation of NATO. Next month, we are expecting the visit of the Deputy Maritime Commander of NATO. This will be the second time in 6 months that he comes over. And this is, I think, a very clear indication that there is an interest and a determination to work closely together. As the Assistant Secretary General mentioned this morning, we receive security advice, information from Georgia on their security assessment on the Black Sea. This helps us a lot in getting awareness of the general security situation, and there are ways we are studying to get this cooperation even closer.
Thank you. It's absolutely important to have tangible actions to strengthen the Black Sea security. And as I mentioned in my introductory remarks, so actions speak louder than the words. And in addition to the commitments of the summit declarations, we are sure that sooner I guess, we'll see some concrete actions from the NATO, from the Black Sea little states that will further strengthen the security and stability in this particular region. Levan, as defined by the North Atlantic Council, the NATO strategic communication is coordinated and appropriate use of NATO communication activities and capabilities in order to advance NATO's aims. And we all know that NATO's aims are stability, projecting stability and security in the Euro-Atlantic area. Do you think that the communication and coordination and appropriate use of these tools are enough to ensure that proper communication strategies in the region, having in mind all the threats and challenges we face currently.
Thank you, and let me also express my gratitude to the organizers for having me here, and thank you, Misha, for your very kind introduction. Since you started with the definition, let me also continue with this topic as well, because I think that actually, despite many years have passed since the phrase strategic communications have been coined, despite number of papers produced on this topic and numerous strategic discussion we had over this issue, I have a feeling that there is no single agreed understanding what strategic communication actually means in real terms. And I would say that definition of the STRATCOM differ from one organization to another and also from one country to another. But what is really common for most of them is the significant emphasis made on coordination and concerted efforts. Also, since NATO is the alliance of states consolidated around main mutual interests, it is still the alliance of the countries with different challenges. And while assessing the mechanisms of NATO's policymaking and NATO's planning, always raise the question whether the alliance will be capable enough to align these different interests into the coherent strategy. And I strongly believe that this question is pretty much applied to the communication strategy as well. In this regard, we should acknowledge that a number of important steps were taken by NATO over the last years, and establishment of NATO Strategic Communication Center of Excellence in Latvia is one clear and good example of progress achieved in this respect. However, I believe that quite profound challenges are still ahead, especially when it comes to coordination on the political messages. In this regard, we should also understand that it is really very important whether we manage to achieve coordination, and this issue is also directly linked to the challenges we are facing in 21st century. And I would say that NATO, as well, all of us globally have been significantly affected by the strategic change of 21st century. Because in the era of changes, in the era of security environment we are having now, it is, which is also characterized by the hybrid threats, the more we are advancing in technologies, the more coordination and more synchronized efforts are required from us. In the era of the Cold War, when the Iron Curtain still stood, making commitments was much easier, because if hostilities had commenced, it was clear that no one member would have been on the sideline. But how we are going, how the alliance is going to leverage the different national instruments into synchronized effort is a big question. Therefore, I would agree with everybody, including to my colleague, that this is the really very big question, how we are going to overcome this challenge with the aim to counter these threats we are facing today. In addition to it, I think that since we are discussing NATO's communication strategy, focusing on the region, I mean mostly focusing on the eastern flank, it is very important to bear in mind two main points. The first is that it was mentioned, and I would reiterate again, that communication strategy should not be adjunct to the policy. It should be integral part of decision-making process. And I also believe that what NATO does or what NATO fails to do both have very serious communication component. And in this regard, I would like to emphasize that Russia's policy vis-à-vis neighbors such as Georgia and Ukraine is quite largely based on the narrative that our European or Euro-Atlantic integration track is unrealistic. And in addition to it, especially in case of Georgia, it is also dangerous due to Georgia's NATO membership aspirations, despite the fact that revising this goal by Ukraine has not saved Ukraine from being the target of aggression and from having territorial disputes with Russia. Therefore, of course, we should be realistic, and we all quite clearly understand that the decisive steps of NATO toward the region will be taken only then when the momentum will be there, and when the so-called window of opportunity will be open. But it is also extremely important to see that as a part of strategy, NATO strategy will be reflected in concrete and decisive steps aimed at significantly strengthening partner countries, respective partner countries' defense capabilities, and also in demonstrating irreversibility of Georgia's membership process, which we got 10 years ago, and we are going to mark 10 years anniversary this year. So this is very important. Otherwise, if we demonstrate that the process is led toward the stalemate, and therefore if we let Russia's narrative stand, that will negatively imply not only on Georgia's security, but it will have extremely negative implications across the security environment, across the whole Euro-Atlantic area. But moreover, if we send clear messages to Georgia, that will have strategic positive implications, because that will be a message to the whole region that if the country performs well, demonstrates, develops democratic institutions, and meets all the recommendations. These recommendations are not just merely kind recommendations, but they are the conditions. If responded properly, it is followed by quite decisive steps, bringing security and prosperity on their part of the world.
Thank you, Levan, for very comprehensive coverage, and your comments reminded me one very good example how to counter Russia's propaganda. I'm sure all of you are aware that Russians were promoting a narrative in Georgia that doors of Europe will never be opened for Georgians, and the decision of the European Union to grant us the visa-free was the game changer, and it finally buried this narrative, and we need the same actions in regards to other disinformation and false information which are spread by the Russian Federation in Georgia. I was reminded to encourage you to actively use the Twitter hashtag NATO Days 2008, and the second account is indicated here. Feel free to send your questions and spread information about the forum using Twitter. We are short of time, therefore I would like to ask both Barbara and Rosaria to very briefly give us the sense how NATO helps Ukraine and how NATO helps Georgia to strengthen their national communication, strategic communication capacities, and how you're helping us to deal with the threats related to the disinformation and spreading the absurd from the Russia. Please.
Sure. Yeah, thank you very much. So I am currently representing or working for the NATO Information Documentation Center in Ukraine, which is part of the NATO representation. And our office has actually been in Ukraine for almost 21 years. So this tells you and shows you that it's more than 2 decades that NATO has been trying in Ukraine to promote what NATO is and to battle and fight the old stereotypes and myths that were still inherited from the Soviet Union's past history. But at the same time, the 2013 and 14 events have been not only a game changer for Ukraine and Ukrainian society themselves, but also for our work there. And I'm not Ukrainian. I usually don't like to talk about events that I have not witnessed myself. But I think for you to understand where we are now, I would just a little bit dig into the events of 2014 during Euromaidan. And there are people in the audience, like Alina Frolova over there, who has been one of the key players in this area in terms of communication. Why? Because in my humble opinion, from what I read, from what I understood, one of the issues that was happening in the winter of 2014 was what I call a Russian propaganda blitzkrieg against Ukraine. And unfortunately, Ukraine was unprepared, unlike Georgia in 2008, to handle this information war that got unleashed. And it was only the brave citizens of Ukraine, the individual people, the PR experts, the communication people who said enough is enough, and they came together in March and started creating grassroots organizations such as the Ukrainian Crisis Media Center or Stop Fake or Inform Napalm and many others to actually get together and push back on the Russian disinformation, which was spreading not only towards its own citizens, but also getting the message out of what is happening in reality in Ukraine abroad. So there is a lot of work and absolute compliments that go to all these people and all these institutions for what they have done, and I would dare to say they actually saved the day for Ukraine. And they continue working, and we are very proud to be partners with them and support them till today. But this has also shown a great Achilles heel of the Ukrainian government and Ukrainian institutions, that they lacked government communications, yet alone strategic communications. And therefore, in 2015, NATO signed a strategic communications partnership roadmap with the Ukrainian government, in which we received a mandate to help to assist Ukrainian institutions to build their strategic communication system, to get better in understanding that government communication is an important function, that each and every ministry should have a well-functioning communications department, and it's not just about having a press officer who runs around and organizes a press conference for his or her minister, but it's really about having a strategy and objectives of proactive communication. And we are proud to say that a lot has been done in Ukraine. We work on a daily basis with many of the ministries, the Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of Information Policy, the National Guards, and a lot of other institutions, particularly in the defense and security sector reform. And within this, within the mandate we have within this roadmap, excuse me, one of the key roles that we can play, or we could play, was to facilitate the exchange of information and of experience, not only of NATO as such, but also of many of our allies and individual member states who shared their processes, their legislation, their structures of their strategic communications with Ukrainian counterparts. And this has been quite an achievement, I believe. Of course, a lot still needs to be done. We provided a lot of trainings. The NATO Center of Excellence that was mentioned here for many times on strategic communication has been one of our greatest friends in this regard. So this is really a very important part of our work. At the same time, in the Warsaw Summit in 2016, as part of our comprehensive assistance package to Ukraine, we established a so-called hybrid warfare platform. It's basically like a clearinghouse between NATO and Ukraine and our member states, where we identify jointly interesting projects or interesting topic of interest between Ukraine and us. For example, last week, I believe it was, in Vilnius, Lithuania, we had a workshop, a seminar on disinformation, and Ambassador Alias is here, who organized it. We also are now looking at more projects to be fulfilled in the fall. We also have helped through a UK trust fund on strategic communication, which is given, which is mandated for NATO headquarters, but from this trust fund we managed to help a little bit the colleagues from the Ministry of Information Policy in looking into setting up a truly functioning crisis communications system for Ukrainian institutions. And last but not least, this is something new which we started doing and we are very proud, is to put into practice what we have been hearing for the past couple of years, and that namely that Ukraine has gathered, unfortunately, but it has gathered enormous experience from Russian disinformation on its own citizens, but more particularly on its own soldiers and volunteers who are fighting at the front line. These soldiers, these troops, are under constant, I would call it almost psychological operations activities by Russia. They have gained enormous experience, which, for example, our own NATO allies don't have. And this is an avenue where actually Ukraine can share with the NATO its experience. So we are looking at organizing study trips and exchange programs. And we did the first study trip 2 weeks ago with a couple of representatives from different institutions and allied bodies up to, into the terrain, into the front lines with the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, and it was a very successful and interesting event. We got really useful survey feedback, and we are looking at expanding this sort of practical exchange as well. So not just talking, as someone said, not just talking, but also doing something about it.
That's how it should be, definitely. Rosaria.
Thank you. We also have quite a number of things to be proud of. First of all, we have a strategic communication expert supported by the United Kingdom, who's working as part of one of the initiatives of the SNGP. She's based in the Ministry of Defense with the idea of supporting the Ministry of Defense in developing its capacity to work on strategic communication, but also with the idea of creating synergies across the government and with all the different institutions. We have provided trainings to Georgian experts, both here in Georgia and trainings outside. I think last December we had a training for experts of different ministers or governmental agencies here in Tbilisi with representatives of the Center of Excellence on Strategic Communication. As I said, we invite often Stratcom personnel to Brussels, and there are a lot of efforts on a bilateral basis. Again, the UK plays a very important role. The United States has just launched a very big project. But I mean, in terms of also what you were saying before, that words are not deeds, I also wanted to say that actually words can be deeds if they provide enough information about the deeds that are being carried out. But the question is that, I mean, NATO is doing a lot in Georgia, and sometimes not everyone is completely aware of what is happening. I mean, not everyone is aware of the wide range of tools and opportunities and all the changes that have taken place thanks to the tight and close cooperation that has been taking place over the last years. That's why, I mean, we've been very supportive of the NATO-Georgia days. I mean, I've myself traveled to a number of different regions. I was in Lagodeci on Friday, I was in Senaki. Most of my staff also has been traveling around. We feel that it is very important to talk with everyday people. We spoke with teachers, with local administrators, with students, not with the idea of actually doing any propaganda, but to inform them, to give them the instruments to be able then to contrast propaganda or counter-information. I mean, if you have information, factual information on things that are going on, then you can also you are enabled to ask yourself, is this true when you get information coming from the outside? Should I take it as as a true piece of information. So, I mean, it has been instructive for us, but I think it has been important for the people as well, and that's why we have been engaging. I also want to say that we do have a lot of activities here in Tbilisi. We work a lot with NGOs, especially to work to use them as a bridge, if you want, with minority communities, with communities that do not have access to a lot of information about what is going on. We have our Facebook page, so we also try to be very proactive, trying to talk primarily with the people who have less knowledge about what is going on. We use a lot the NDI data survey information to identify the target audience. And of course, I mean, we use the OASIS approach that Barbara mentioned before, identifying objects, audiences, strategies, and define an implementation. So,
thank you for all of the efforts, and NATO particularly. You mentioned the SNGP, and strategic communication is a part of the SNGP package, but there are also other key elements which. The first thing which came to my mind is NATO-Georgia Joint Training and Evaluation Center, which is a tangible, feasible thing, and the proper message tailored to this infrastructure, it gets a lot of traction in Georgia and outside of Georgia. Levan, very briefly, can you talk about the role of the civil society organizations in confronting the threats that comes from the Russia, especially the disinformation? So what should be the role of the civil society? I see here my good friends who tirelessly fight with the Russian propaganda. So can you give us your sense on that?
Thank you for this question, because I think that civil society organizations have a crucial role when it comes to strategic communication for numerous reasons. First is that civil society organization, as you absolutely rightly mentioned, can play important role in countering Russian propaganda and also disseminating positive messages. Another point is that NGOs can always indicate to the government about the deficiencies in strategic communication, and I'm glad to say that on both of issues, Georgian NGO community is quite active. Apart from it is really important to achieve maximum level of coordination among governmental and non-governmental organizations. Because I think that considering the challenges Georgia is facing today, strategic communication in our case, it's not about government's communication with the society per se. It is, I think, should be seen in a wider prism, and we should realize that strategic communication, due to the challenges, is directly linked to Georgia's national security threats and challenges. And of course, it also deals with effective implementation of our foreign policy objectives. Hence, I believe that consolidation of the efforts on governmental, non-governmental organizations, the role of our international partners is significantly and very important. Another point, of course, we all understand the main responsibility still lies on the government. And when it comes to challenges at the national level, it is really very important to see that strategic communication system does not function only on the reactive mode. Of course, due to the scale of the propaganda targeted towards Georgia, we cannot ignore fake messages and fake informations. And responding to it is very important. But also taking a proactive step is really very important, because I think that proactive process will enable us to have positive influence on the attitude of Georgian, of the relevant target audience, which is far more important rather than changing the behavior of target audience through reactive processes. It will have much long-term implications on the audience rather than in case responses. And this is very important to bear in mind. Also, it is crucial to keep in mind that this process should not be isolated from other elements of strategic communication. It should be part of extremely synchronized and well-coordinated process, which would be based on different elements, including all the results of target audience analysis. So here where we stand today, of course, we have lots of challenges, And also I would like to mention that the role of international partners was mentioned many times. And of course, our partners and our allies contributed a lot to strengthen Georgia's strategic communication capacity, and we should appreciate it also, of course. But I would like to mention, as Prime Minister also absolutely rightly underlined, it's really exceptional, the support of the United States to the government of Georgia on strategic communication. And I think that government of Georgia strategic communication program developed by the US Embassy provides all necessary tools to significantly improve the Georgian government strategic communication system. I would like to express gratitude and to underline with positive messages that we are thankful that government seems engaged, and there's a quite positive engagement in this process. But of course, I would recommend once again to benefit from this process to the fullest possible extent.
Thank you, Levan. I also want to join you in thanking our American friends for their tireless efforts to support Georgia's democracy, territorial integrity, sovereignty, and as we all know, the United States is a staunch supporter of Georgia's NATO membership. So we have about 15 minutes for Q&A session. So I see the hand here, second one is over there, and the third here. Please.
Thank you. Aldis Kudors, Center for East European Policy Studies, Latvia. Thank you for your presentations. And I will start with my human perspective. One interesting event was in Riga, and I was tested by one Stratcom specialist. And he asked me, Andis, what does it mean, strategic communications? And I start to explain about process, about organizational process, target groups, etc., which is correct one, but that is part of strategic communications. And he said me, when you think or if you are making speech about strategic communications, always, especially if you will try to implement strategic communications, think about goal. If there is strategic communications, there has to be strategic goal. And that is my problem with NATO. And Mr. Dalidze already touched this about this political, maybe different use in particular governments of NATO member states. For example, me as a Latvian, my human perspective to Georgia, I mean to the NATO strategic goal with Georgia is simple. I would like to see Georgia as soon as possible member of NATO. And I would like to see more decisive steps from NATO and NATO member states to get it done. So am I in harmony with, for example, government of Germany or France? I'm not sure. So, and when I speak with colleagues from NATO Strategic Center in Riga, and they said that, yeah, people are coming to them and asking, where is your fight? And a second question is about, do we have the same strategic goal toward Russia? Are all NATO member states seeing strategic goal with Russia the same? I'm not sure. So it's a NATO Stratcom Center in Riga. It's just part of this picture, and they are not able to fight war, I mean in strategic sense, not in military sense, instead of all governments do. So this is a challenge. It's not so easy to speak about strategic communications without common goal. It's more rhetoric question. Everyone can pick up it. So how to resolve it? Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for your comment. So, gentleman over there, and then the gentle lady in the fourth row.
Thank you. I'm Georgi Oniani from Transparency International Georgia. Thank you for brilliant presentations. My question goes to Ms. Maronkova. Just to summarize very briefly the Stratcom, the strategic communication activities against Russian propaganda currently, it would be that we're basically responding to Russian offensive on our own soils. Like we're in a responsive mode to whatever they're doing in our backyard. So are there any plans, or generally would you think it would be a good idea to really start thinking of preempting those efforts by Russia on their soil? Just start working or with or on the Russian population and Russian Russian society there. Thank you.
And the third question here.
Lina Frolova, advisor to the Minister of Information Policy, Ukraine. So the Ambassador Ildam was saying that one of the focuses is just strengthening the partnership and making defense on the partnership territory, let's say. But I know about the position of NATO, and we mainly discuss it with you a lot of times in Ukraine, that this is the responsibility of the government of Georgia or Ukraine to promote their NATO and EU policy inside those countries. And there is some kind of, in my picture, there is some kind of misunderstanding, because the information domain is main domain for the warfare. But at the same time, NATO doesn't see its obvious presence in promoting itself in the partner countries, in setting up the values of NATO and EU in the partner countries. And as soon as Ambassador also said that the structure of NATO would be one of the main discussions on the next summit, is there any changes in this position expected? And is there any changes that will increase the role of information and role of communications in NATO activities, and especially in partner countries? Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. We have two questions and one comment which calls the question how to make sure that NATO allies have the common understanding on their strategic goals. So
well, maybe I can start and then pass the ball to Rosaria. I might combine let's say, the first and the second question to a certain degree. I think it is the nature of our organization. As I said, it's an intergovernmental organization. And since 1949, we have one key principle, and that's consensus on which we take decisions. So we can only communicate as NATO on what our currently 29 allies agree and give us a mandate. Of course, communication or public diplomacy or strategic communication can only do when you have some political mandate. So when there is a political decision, then we can communicate. If we don't have a political decision, we can have the best communication strategy, but we can't do that. So I think it boils down back to taking the political decision that is required, necessary, requested, for example, in regards to our position to Russia or the open door or enlargement or whatever else. So this is the nature of the beast, so to speak. At the next summit in July, and Ambassador Ildam already touched on it this morning, but one of the big topics that we expect will be discussed is exactly our continued or changed or slightly amended strategy towards Russia. Once our bosses, our leaders take some decision in this regard in July, then we can start discussing and thinking about our strategic communication approach. But so far we have our policy, which is, you probably know very well, defense, deterrence and dialogue. But I don't know if you have seen on Friday when we had the foreign ministers meeting in Brussels, the Secretary General made a very interesting statement to the media where he said, we are not in a Cold War, but we're also not in strategic partnership with Russia anymore. So we are in something new, it's new for us, and we need to figure out what we do. So might not be an answer that people would wish for, but that's simply a reality of our organization. The same goes on the questions about our approach to Russia and whether we are going to start working also in communicating with Russian citizens. I mean, we have done that. I mentioned that my office is 21 years in Ukraine. There is a NATO information office in Moscow for more than 15 years as well, and it's still operating despite the current situation. Now, of course, it can do only limited engagement. It cannot do as much as we were able to do before, but still we think this is important footprint to have there. We continue engaging with Russian citizens. I mentioned we have Russian journalists that we bring to NATO. We bring Russian students and academics to NATO. We are looking at ways how to engage with them more broadly. But again, we can only communicate when we have the green light and the mandate, which is then evolving from our political decisions. And last but not least, about the communication, let's say, division of labor between the NATO offices and the individual governments. Of course, our job is to inform the citizens about what is NATO, yeah? How the organization works, what is it composed of, bring maybe some historical clarity, dispel myths. But first and foremost, it's about communicating about what we do in Ukraine. That's our most important goal. While at the same time, if a country decides to go for NATO membership, it declares its aspirations, then we believe it is the responsibility of the national government, because it cannot be me as a NATO official going around Ukrainian cities and schools telling the Ukrainian people that joining NATO is a good thing. It's not credible from me. It will be perceived as a propaganda. It's the country officials, but also civil society, that have to do this job. And that's what I did, for example, in Slovakia when I worked in an NGO, which was promoting Slovakia's membership to NATO. From time to time, we would have a NATO official who would show up and have some nice speech, like I have now at the conference. But at the end of the day, it was really up to us, Slovak citizens, Slovak journalists, Slovak, famous people, some of our government officials, some parliamentarians who would basically get together. We didn't have major stratcom strategies. That word didn't exist in those days, in 2002, 2003, but we simply did it. And that I think is important. Now, of course, we do everything we can, which is within our mandate, is to support Ukraine or any other government in their efforts. But at the end of the day, to work with the citizens about whether it's a good thing to join this organization, we believe is for the country itself. We can try to explain what is NATO, put it in perspective. And I believe this is what we are doing.
Zari, Levan, do you want to reflect on that?
I don't have a lot to add. I mean, of course, we are on the same line with Barbara. But I mean, it is true that the line between information and propaganda is very, very thin. And I always have the feeling when I talk to people that their level of trust can actually fall dramatically if they feel that I'm doing propaganda. That's why when I try to stay as factual, as pragmatic as possible, I try to explain what the lines that we have actually mean. What does it mean having more NATO in Georgia and having more Georgia in NATO? What does it mean that Georgia has all the instruments? Because these are things that, I mean, they are that are understood. For us here in Tbilisi, we meet each other at conferences. We have a lot of opportunities to talk to each other. But outside, and I'm not even saying in the countryside, but even in minor towns of Georgia, these issues are not immediately clear. So I think it is important even to clarify what is really going on at the moment. And this is important. It supports.
Thank you, Levan.
Yeah. If you allow me, so I would like to reflect on the question about the goals. And I completely share your vision about the topic you mentioned, but still I believe that when it comes to goals, allies are still on the same page. I think the difference is in the level of readiness to take decisions. Otherwise, I think the goal is the same. Whether one or another ally is to take decisive step now. And that's why I think that we need a sort of an out-of-box thinking, and we need some new elements in those decisions. And also, since we are approaching the next NATO summit, I think that this opportunity should be used very effectively. Because we all understand that the message of the alliance, for example, that NATO ensures security of member states, and NATO is just able to provide support to the security of partner countries. It is quite understandable, it is quite logical. I would say that it is in full compliance with the Washington Treaty, which was approved back in 1949. But we need a bit more different approaches here, because in the era where we have when we live in the era of the hybrid warfare, when we have quite blurry lines between war and peace, when we see that Russia uses different tactics with the aim to undermine territorial integrity and sovereignty of the countries in Europe, I would say, focusing on the same message only would be dangerous. And that's why we need a bit more creative steps to take. We also understand, and I am sure we all agree, that Article 5 will be enacted only in case we have aggression against the member state, and it is logical. We also understand that NATO has done a lot with the aim to project stability beyond NATO borders, but we need to take more steps. We need to use all opportunities to significantly strengthen the resilience of the partner countries which are target of Russia. We need to take more important steps with the aim to significantly strengthen defense capabilities of those countries. Otherwise, the message, if we reinforce the same message, so some people may think that, including first of all in Moscow, that focusing on the same message that we just can't support without taking decisive steps by drawing red line across the border of NATO, we are also marking somebody's green line. And this would be extremely dangerous. And that's why we need more creativity in this respect. And I think that of course it's difficult, but we should also understand that achieving significant objectives has never been easy. And that's why we have to take very important steps. And I think that the topics such as, for example, hybrid warfare, or tools how to counter hybrid warfare, as well as deliberations on the black security, among other dimensions, are the areas where we can look for some opportunities what to do. And I think we need to use these opportunities effectively. Thank you.
Thank you, Levan. Thank you. It's crystal clear that we need actions. Going back to my quote from William Shakespeare, words are not deeds, and we need actions. We need actions, we need robust actions. And when we talk among ourselves, among friends, what could be the next action that will strengthen stability and security of the region? Needless to say, the first thing that comes is inviting Georgia to NATO, and sooner this happens, the better it will be for the security of the region, for the security of Europe, and for the security of Euro-Atlantic area. So our time is up, and I want to apologize for stealing 20 minutes from your coffee time. Next panel starts at 3. Please grab your coffee and come back to the auditorium. And now I want to thank our panelists for their very thoughtful comments. So thank you.